Okay, so we are back for our final lecture on religious establishment, and in this lecture we will discuss religious monuments and displays. First, though, I'd like to do something, just a little test that I have a lot of fun with, actually. I'd like you to have a look at these two monuments and write down for me as many differences between these two monuments as you can find. And why don't you pause the lecture right now and just take a few moments to do that, and then at the end of the lecture we'll come back to it. Okay, so we're going to talk about religious displays first, and this is an area in which the court has had to deal with displays primarily put up by cities during religious holidays that also have secular content. Christmas and other holidays. And the first case we need to discuss is Lynch versus Donnelly. Now, this was a case involving a creche. A creche is a display of the Holy Family at the birth of Christ. And you see it all over the place. It's the manger with the little house behind it, and sheep and shepherds, and the three wise men, and Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus all displayed together. The creche is actually the little structure behind it, the little house kind of thing. In this case, in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, they had displayed this creche for 4 decades in a park owned by a nonprofit organization. And the display wasn't just simply the creche. As your text notes, it included Santa Claus, reindeer, a Christmas tree, colored lights, a season's greeting banner, the creche, and a clown. Who knows why the clown was there? I guess nothing says Christmas like a clown. But the court looks at this and says, okay, this creche is displayed not on public property, but on property owned privately. The creche is, I believe, purchased by the city, and for about $1,400 in 1973, and the city spends about $20 annually to put it up and take it down as part of this display. The city makes the argument, and the Supreme Court buys this argument, that the display has a secular purpose. It's part of not just a religious festival, but an effort to attract holiday shoppers to the downtown mercantile district and to generate income for merchants during the holiday season. And the court says, yes, we agree. The creche is okay. These creche scenes are okay if they're part of a larger display. Justice Berger writes, and he compares this um, uh, to an unbroken history of official acknowledgement by all three branches of government of the role of religion in American life. He talks about some of these things like executive orders proclaiming Christmas and Thanksgiving national holidays, In God We Trust on our currency, and the public's support of art galleries that are full of religious paintings. And he says that this creche scene is just part of that, and since it is part of a broader display, and there is a secular purpose here, the display does not violate the Establishment Clause. However, another case comes up, Allegheny County versus ACLU. And in this case, we had a public display, um, but the creche did not belong to the city. It belonged to a Roman Catholic group, the Holy Name Society. And it was set up in a place by which everyone had to pass in a public building, okay, in a place in the county courthouse by which everyone who entered that building had to pass when they did business with the state. And it was set up by itself. However, there was a second display, as your text notes, there's a second display located outside um, the building where the mayor and other city officials had their offices. And this included, this consisted of a display much more like we saw in Lynch versus Donnelly. There was a Christmas tree and ornaments, an 18-foot menorah owned by a Jewish group that had been erected by the city. And the court says that the physical setting is key here. The fact that the creche was displayed by itself in the county courthouse, in a place that was most public and most beautiful about the courthouse. And also there was also a public display of words above it in Latin. And there tended to be an endorsement, an appearance of an endorsement by the state of Catholicism. Furthermore, the court said that not only did the creche violate the Establishment Clause because it stood alone, but the Christmas tree and the menorah did not run foul of the Constitution. They were symbols of various forms of celebrating Christmas, and thus they don't violate it because they don't violate the Establishment Clause because of their physical setting. Writing for the court uses the Lemon test here, actually, and Justice Blackmun writes for a plurality because the court couldn't put together a majority. Says our decisions further have refined the definition of governmental action that unconstitutionally advances religion after Lemon. In recent years, we have paid particularly close attention to whether the challenged governmental practice either has the purpose or effect of endorsing religion, a concern that has long had a place in our Establishment Clause jurisprudence. The court says that one display is okay, the other display is not. Now, this brings us to McCreary. In this case, the court considered a Ten Commandments that had been placed on a public building, public grounds of a public building, and the court found that the placement of the commandments had a particularly religious purpose, and says that cannot not be displayed. 10 Commandments could not be displayed in that way. All right, so that brings us to Van Orden versus Perry. The state of Texas displayed a 10 Commandments monument on its grounds and had done so since it had been donated to it by a group called the Eagles, the Fraternal Order of the Eagles. The monument had been there since 1961, and it had been used to promote a movie a film called The Ten Commandments. So the question here was, does the Establishment Clause allow the display of a monument inscribed with the Ten Commandments on the Texas state capitol grounds, or does that violate the Religious Establishment Clause? And the court says, yeah, the Establishment Clause allows this kind of display. This has a dual significance, the court says. It was both governmental and religious. And the fact that it was not purely religious was important to the court. I want to stop for a moment and try and go back here really quickly to look at the monuments that I showed you at first. Okay, so this monument on the right side of the screen, that's the monument on the Texas Capitol grounds. It says here, presented to the people and youth of Texas by the Fraternal Order of Eagles of Texas, 1961. So you spent some time thinking about this. What are the difference between these commandments, these monuments? Well, first of all, the one on the left is on private property. That's a church behind it, and that monument was put there on private property owned by the church. Okay, this one, the one on the right, was put there not by the state, but it was donated to the state for the purposes of advertising a movie and encouraging people to go to the movie to think about the Ten Commandments. So the court actually says, and obviously the one on the left is, clearly a church can put up whatever monument it wants to on its property. But the one on the right, the court actually says that that monument is okay because it's not very religious. It's not very religious. Understand that? This text, the Ten Commandments, has extraordinary religious significance to 2 out of the 3 great religions in Western civilization, and yet the court says it can be there because it's not particularly very religious. It's been there for a long time. It was donated for a secular reason to promote a movie as a form of advertising. So that's okay. As long as our religious symbols aren't very religious, we can display them on government property. That presents some serious problems for people who are religious, if we would think about that. It demeans the religious significance of our most sacred symbols. And the court says that that Ten Commandments is okay because it's not very religious. That should give us all pause. All right, well, let's go back to this last slide here and discuss governmental involvement in the affairs of religious organizations. So as we say here, Lemon makes it clear that government cannot intrude in the affairs of religious organizations. But it's true that many church activities today are subject to regulations by government. If you want to be a church leader, if you want to do various things in church, and a lot of those activities are regulated by government. So if those activities are regulated, what about the internal affairs of those groups? Can government get involved in the internal affairs of groups, in particular when it comes to giving money and also declaring the number of gifts and the amount of gifts and the use that those gifts are put to? That in itself involves some entanglement of government with religion. In particular here I'm talking about the leaders of mega churches and organizations that subsist primarily through the donations of members who watch television programs and those sorts of things. Should government get involved in the internal affairs of those groups? A lot of those groups are, many of us would think, are not particularly religious and primarily geared toward getting people to donate money. I'm not certain of the answer to that question, and I think it's something we should give some thought to. All right, thank you very much for your time, and that concludes the lectures on religious establishment.